Let's now open it up to the floor. I'm sure there are lots of questions. There are mics on that side and on that side. Please tell us who you are, your affiliation, if any, and keep your questions or comments brief and concise. We always say that, and it often doesn't work, but I'm saying it again. Please make your interventions as concise as possible. Over there.
Thank you, Ian Chong. So I want to pick up on...
Could you tell me where you're from? Just right.
NUS. So I want to pick up on your earlier comments on the AIIB. So I understand your critique of the U.S. administration, the Obama administration's approach to the AIIB. But what would you suggest that the administration do now? It's put some prestige on previously on trying to prevent allies from joining, but now allies have joined, and more seem to be doing so. Would the Obama administration have to sort of go to China now and say, yes, sorry, we're wrong, we were being dumb, please work with us now? I mean, so I understand the critique, but what's the solution?
It's a good policy question.
And so, sorry, just one other thing too. So for an economy, you talk about innovation. So for an economy that is that has a big government role, that doesn't have the sort of freedom of access to information, and is it's deeply integrated but fairly small, like Singapore. How would you propose innovation to take place? I mean, having a Lee Kuan Yew is not a solution. That's winning the genetic lottery. That's not innovation. So thanks. Those two questions.
On your first question, very important policy lesson for all of you to apply. When you find yourself in a hole, stop digging. That's the starting point. And it's interesting you ask this, because again, I actually reflected on this a little bit over the past day, I guess just out of policy practice. I think what I would probably do would be I would identify the priority features that I think it's important to include in the Asian Infrastructure Bank. And here I've got a little unfair advantage since I used to be in that business. There's a kind of how you do the procurement, different aspects of the governance structure. I'll give you an example. When I was at the World Bank, we worked out an arrangement with all the regional development banks, Europe, Asia, Inter-American Bank, Africa, so that we, if some country was banned from doing business because they had been found to be corrupt, that we all banned them. People might be surprised. We didn't have that procedure. So there are ways in which the World Bank and the regional development banks already had sort of inter-cooperation on things. So I would identify the core issues, okay, and I would then, and in particular, perhaps even a level beyond, which is to say, I remember visiting Laos, and the World Bank had a very extensive dam project, Nam Thang Dang. It took a long time because there were various criticisms, but at the end it was an incredibly effective project environmentally, relocating people, so on and so forth. And frankly, I was a little worried about some of the dams I saw getting put up on the Mekong River and others. So maybe I'd even take some specific areas and say, for infrastructure development, these are areas that have to be done under a certain way. And I'd come up with some reasonable number of items, and then I would urge the leaders in China, I'd urge Jinlin Quinn, who I think is open to try to do some of these things, and I would urge the countries joining it to kind of agree on a set, and then push them all together. And then I would simultaneously suggest that the World Bank's arms, like whether the IFC or the Infrastructure Center here in Singapore, offer to cooperate with the Infrastructure Bank on infrastructure projects and develop some terms of engagement. So I've seen people talk about co-investment. That's a sideline, okay? It's really the structure you create of these arrangements. And then frankly, this also is a useful test, because if the Asian Infrastructure Bank is unwilling to make these changes, well then some of the US criticisms are valid, and then people will have to make their own decision. But I would give people the benefit of the doubt, and I would at least try to identify what are the things. And at the end of the day, you have to put coefficients on with these. So do I really care whether it's a residential board versus an outside board? To be honest, the residential board, which I had to deal with, was it was sort of a legacy of pre-air travel, okay? So look, I had 25 executive directors, board members, okay, that were on site, and they had a staff of 300, and it was a $70 million a year cost, okay, that we had to try to, frankly, keep them contented, right? And it was a stupid system. And frankly, Governor Zedillo, or former President Zedillo of Mexico, did a review of governance. And so the idea that the United States says, oh, you need an on-site board, that's not the critical thing. Remember, APEC started actually without a big system. We constantly use senior officials. So I'd focus on the substance of kind of how to make that work, and then I'd press the discussions with other partners and others. For your second question about innovation in China, or in Singapore, I'm not the one to talk. This country's done pretty well. So I guess I would focus on principles, which is the principles to keep yourself open to competition, make sure that you've got easy to have people sort of come and go, create the right investment environment. I was explaining when I negotiated the free trade agreement with Singapore in 2001 and 2, my counterpart was George Yeo, a good friend, and I remember saying to George, I'm really glad we did this. It's important for our two countries. It's important for the region. But you're a pretty free trading country. What was your interest in it, other than the association with the United States? And I was struck by the fact that he said, we need to move up the value-added chain. And frankly, your free trade agreements are seen as having the highest quality intellectual property rights. So we want to set that standard, and then we think it'll draw more knowledge industries. And I remember a few years later coming to visit part of Singapore and seeing all these pharmaceutical companies and others. So I guess, I would focus more on the principles, and then I suppose the other thing which Singapore is doing to a degree is you concede the sort of the intellectual capability, whether it's biotechnology, whether it's other things, you can foster research, various types of R&D. Now probably the late Lee Kuan Yew and I would agree, I don't believe in just throwing money at stuff, so then you also have to set some standards and result measurements. So I guess I would focus on that. And I guess the last point really will be the challenge for Singapore will be whether the larger ecosystem of education and work and others can encourage creativity. And there are aspects of the system that could foster that, but there's other aspects of the system that might stymie that. And so I've actually been impressed that, to take a slightly different example of how in the education system here, not surprisingly, this is a very meritocratic system, and the people that rise to the top obviously perform very well on tests, and they perform in a very certain academic sort of pattern. But I was struck that there was a recognition that some people learn differently. Some people learn more visually, kind of working on projects. And the educational system here seems to be trying to adapt and realize that people learn in different patterns. So I'll just say this, I'm not trying to just flatter people. I've enjoyed the interactions I've had with Singapore ministers over 25 years. I don't always agree with everything, I learn a lot, and I think that this slight sense of paranoia is probably a healthy quality.
Okay, thank you. Gentleman over there, and then I'll come to you.
Good afternoon, Wicket from NTU. How would you like to see the relationship between between US and China evolving over the next 5 years? Between US and China, and US and ASEAN? Best case scenario, likely case scenario, and worst case scenario over the next 5 years. Thank you.
Are you allowed to ask multi-part questions like that? Well, over the next 5 years, I would like to see the United States be supportive of China's economic reforms, and to do so in a way that China takes further steps in terms of its international economic obligations, for example, a bilateral investment treaty with a negative list, and and a open service sector, which could be done in the WTO negotiations, that would help China, that would help the United States, and would help the world economic institutions. So I have a kind of a list of those items. The issue that I'm extremely concerned about is cybersecurity. While countries are going to spy on each other, and I'm not shocked by that, one of the challenges the United States has is explaining to China that it's okay to spy on the government, but it's not okay to spy on companies and steal their stuff. It's a serious issue. I mean, and frankly, I had talked with some of my colleagues in the Obama administration. Tom Donilon was one of them, who is a national security advisor, trying to have this discussion with China before the Snowden stuff broke and kind of killed the whole climate for it. I would like to see some progress made on that issue, because I think it's one that would be very dangerous for the international economy and relations. And then third, on the political security front, I would like to see China work out its relationships with ASEAN, Japan, Korea, India, others in the region, in a way that recognizes the stability of the international system we've created over the past 70 years, and it creates an environment where all can prosper together. And if I get another one, I guess I would also say that on issues of carbon and some of the energy developments, that's another sort of critical area that I think both could make progress. And maybe even on the broader political security side, to continue to encourage China and the United States to find mutual interests in, for example, dealing with the danger of North Korea or stability in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and seeing, while there's never going to be a total alignment, to try to understand things. So let me give you a very practical example, is that when I had the first strategic talks with Daibing Guo when I was at the State Department, which became these various strategic dialogues, I said to him, look, I'm not trying to suggest the United States is pushing this, but let's assume someday that North Korea collapses, okay? What happens to stability in the region? Okay? And I said, now, your first reaction in China might be that you wouldn't want a unified Korea to keep its alliance with the United States. I said, but part of that might be a concern that the United States would have military forces on the Yalu, which I don't believe it would. I believe actually the land forces would be withdrawn. You might keep some air and naval assets. And I said, but think about the alternative. Let's say South Korea, with its history, no longer has an alliance relationship with the United States or a unified Korea, and yet it inherits a nuclear weapon. Might it keep it, given its big neighbors in Russia, China, Japan? And if Korea does that, what will that do in Japan? All of a sudden, Russia, China, Korea, the United States all have nuclear weapons, but Japan doesn't. So these are some of the stabilizing issues. And I'll tell you the one that people need to think about now, again, is that let's just assume someday that North Korean regime did collapse. What would happen to the nuclear facilities? Do the Chinese secure them? Do the South Koreans secure them? Do we do them jointly? Do we ignore them and let the stuff go out? So, these are the tough public policy questions that, from my spirit, at least the United States and China need to get those on the table, need to be thinking about those sort of topics. So I think there's a very large positive agenda, but I also, if you talk about the US perspective, and this because you asked about ASEAN, the United States, while there's a lot it can do with China, always needs to approach this from a regional and alliance perspective. So at the same time, we need to have strong ties with Japan, with Korea, with Australia, with our ASEAN partners, and not to contain China, because I don't think you can. I think that's a fool's errand and you'll lose your friends. But to try to create some hedge in relationships and let China know that when it gets too aggressive and starts to threaten other countries, that that'll be counterproductive. So from a US policy perspective, it is just a good little footnote for you to keep in mind. Whenever you think about a bilateral relationship, you also ought to think about the regional and alliance relationships.
My name is Anant Nageshwaran. Recently, I co-authored a book with your former colleague, Dr. T.V. Somanathan, TV as you call him,
Yeah.
on derivatives. I'm adjunct faculty at the Singapore Management University here. On October 26th, you wrote a piece in the FT and you said, a topic of interest for the US and Germany would be to explore whether Germany and the EU have a role in Asia beyond commercial ties. What exactly did you have in mind? Has it happened? If not, what are the steps that need to happen for it to happen? Thank you.
Sure. Well, for the context for the piece, and it's a good question, I'm glad you asked it, because it takes what we've discussed in Asia and puts it to a different context. So to give people a reference point, 25 years ago, I was the U.S. representative under Secretary Baker that negotiated German unification in the 2+4 process. And part of our strategic perspective in 1989-90 was that Germany would become the most important country in Europe, and we needed to deepen our partnership. We fortunately stood by our ally at a moment of national challenge where others in Europe were more hesitant, but gratitude doesn't last too long in foreign relations. So part of it would be, would Germany and the United States, recognizing this can only be done in European structures, because Germany is embedded in Europe, see broader responsibilities. So what I talked about in that piece was, this is a tough question for Germans, for understandable reasons. You know, the word for leadership is Führer in Germany, and that's not a wonderful connotation. So there's some hesitancy. Having said this, I actually think Chancellor Merkel has tried to do some pretty good things overall with Russia and Ukraine, and also with some of the issues in the Eurozone. So I was trying to outline, in a sense, that I think both sides, the US and Germany, had taken each other for granted, and going back to these questions about strategic discussions, we were just dealing case by case with matters as opposed to trying to think about some of the longer trends and how to try to deal with them. And one of those was the role in Asia, and my point was that in my experience in China, that Germany has a lot of respect. There's a respect for Germany's economy, a respect for Germany's engineering. There's less respect for the European Union as a whole. Wang Qishan, when he was in charge of economic relations, once told me, he said, you know, I get these people coming from Brussels, and they tell me they want me to do A, B, and C, and I say, fine, I'd like you to do D, E, and F, and they say, oh no, that's the member states, we can't do that. And he said, well, then send the member states. So, you know, it's a bit of a quip, but I think it reflects a little bit of kind of a Chinese perspective. And so my point with Germany and Asia was that I think by and large Europe simply seized East Asia in terms of commercial and business. I've got nothing against that, but I think if you take what we've just discussed about big changes in an international order and stability, take the question about the Asian Infrastructure Bank, I believe that the US was mistaken in its approach, but I also believe Europe and others should insist on the types of things that we've talked about so that the Asian Infrastructure Bank does become a positive contribution to the international economic system. And there will be other issues, whether it be issues of proliferation or, frankly, maritime security, which is in interest of all parties. And so I believe that Europe can play a constructive role in this region, and from a U.S. perspective, I would like it to do so, and I think Germany will be key to that.
Okay. Would you have time for one last question?
I don't know, Barry said, I'm on my way to the airport. We'll take one more. Okay.
Very quickly, please.
Could you give us your perspective on the U.S.-Iranian nuclear negotiations?
That was a long last question. First point, I think it's important for the United States and others not to look at the nuclear negotiations alone. I think it's very important to look at Iran's behavior and aims in the region as a whole. And I don't think you can separate those, and certainly in the minds of some of the Gulf states in the Arab world I just visited, much less Israel, the concern about Iranian behavior in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, perhaps Yemen, go to the overall question of stability in the region. It's, we talked about stabilizing influences more broadly. That's part of it. Secondly, I think that I'm certainly not against trying to discuss to achieve a deal that would address the Iranian nuclear threat. But part of that, of course, in my mind, would also go to the questions of past Iranian behavior with the nuclear program that the IAEA has identified that people haven't been clear about. And whatever arrangement you put together, and let's just say there are people, whether in the US or frankly some Israeli security figures that said, look, if you could deal the variables in a way that you had enough warning period, whether it's a year or 2 years, that could be more satisfactory than other alternatives. My own guess is that really requires a very intrusive inspection system. So that's a key point. I've been extremely troubled by this notion that the deal would end in X years because at the end of it you take off all the sanctions and where are you, okay? And I don't say this lightly, but I disagree also with the administration on this idea that it's either a deal or war. We talked about negotiations. That's a hell of a way to negotiate. You know, and frankly, I do think there are other options related to sanctions and frankly, having the Iranians also recognize that if they cross lines, they run risks without being specific for other parties. So I'll close with this because part of this, I've done negotiations all my life. I think the administration made a very big mistake in dividing this into two parts and accepting the principle of enrichment de facto, if not de jure, in the first stage. Because the major thing you had to give, because under the NPT and the system, they're not supposed to be enriching. You've got a lot of UN resolutions. To have accepted that in the first stage, in my mind, means that it's going to be very hard to get the other aspects that you need in subsequent stages. Having said all this, I think there's also alliance dimensions about how you work with your other partners in the region. And here's one, just to give some of thought. There's some people that feel that the administration believes that Iran could be changed into a stabilizing force in the region, that it's not just nuclear. I'm pretty skeptical of that. I'm actually worried that if there is a deal, that certain forces in Tehran might actually feel the need to be more aggressive in the region to demonstrate that they still have their independent action. And so there will be need to work with the Saudis, the other Gulf states, as well as Israel, to be very clear on how we'll respond to different types of behavior. Having said all that, you know, I've not been of the view that some where you can conclude before you see the deal, but I'm concerned for the reasons that I mentioned.
Thank you very much. Well, we've been treated to a masterclass in policy analysis ranging from the economic to the security across the whole world. Please join me in thanking Bob Zoellick.